In this video, I'm going to talk about the rise of communism in Russia. In the late 19th century, Russia was seen by followers of Marx as the area that was probably least likely to implement Marxism first, because it was still seen as a more backward, absolutist, monarchical system. But several events occur in the early 20th century that reveal fragilities in the Russian state and open up the opportunity for a Marxist revolution and a communist takeover of Russia. Now, we can talk a lot about attitudes towards the Russian monarchy, spread of revolutionary ideas within Russia, but I'm going to start with the Russian-Japanese War in 1904. The Japanese defeat of the Russians is really humiliating for the Russians, and weaknesses in Russian infrastructure are exposed. It becomes relatively clear that that Russia is not able to support a modern war and carry out providing food for its people at the same time. And this leads to Bloody Sunday, a revolt in the streets of Russia put down with violence by the Russian army that further encourages dissent against the government or resentment of the Russian government. Then in 1914, Russia enters World War I, partly as an effort to restore morale. But of course, we see the same failings exposed again. The Russian army is in no condition to take on the German army, which is the most successful in the world at the time, and is defeated again and again at the same time as the Russian government isn't able to provide food for its people at home. And this dissatisfaction and the lack of leadership of the Russian Tsar, Nicholas II, spill over into what's called the February Revolution, where Nicholas and his family are forced to abdicate and they are replaced by a provisional government. However, the February Revolution is followed by another revolution called the October Revolution, in which a workers' union led by a man named Lenin, which had based its creation around Marxist ideas, overthrows the provisional government and sets up its own communist government of Russia. And now, first under Lenin's leadership and then under Stalin's leadership, we're going to see efforts to implement communism in Russia. First time someone has tried to implement Marxist political philosophy. And so, first, you have the elimination of those who side with the royal family in a long and brutal civil war. You have the execution of the entire royal family. And then you have what comes next in Marx's program, the confiscation of property by the state as a means of, or as a precursor to redistributing this property equally. So any sources of opposition to the Soviet government are eliminated. Independent judiciary, the freedom of the press, opposition parties, all of these are eliminated, and the state starts to confiscate the land in Russia as the beginnings of carrying out this communist redistribution. Of course, this massively impacts agricultural production. Agricultural production falls dramatically, and Lenin realizes that if he's going to save the Russian Revolution, he has to hold off on this more radical aspect of Marxism, at least for a little bit. And so he permits more of a capitalist economic approach, and the Russian Revolution recovers. You go from the situation where millions of people are starving because agricultural production has dropped so much, to a situation in which things are improving for the Russians. Lenin dies in 1924 and is replaced by Stalin, who through his ruthlessness and his organizational skill had risen to become one of Lenin's trusted subordinates. And Stalin's goal is to fully industrialize Russia. He sees the full industrialization of Russia as following the Marxist theory of history. He sees it as necessary if Russia is to defend itself against the bourgeoisie, who he imagines, because class conflict, are going to be planning to invade Russia and overthrow the communist government. And he sees industrialization as the only way for Russia to catch up with the rest of the world and prove that Marxist economics are more successful. And so he begins by trying to eliminate or trying to reduce the rural peasant population in order to support this industrialization of Russia. So hundreds of thousands of peasants are removed from their farms and deported to labor camps in Siberia, where they begin the process of industrializing Russia, or the process of kickstarting the industrialization of Russia. Again, we see, in consequence, the agricultural output of Russia decline, and again, we see millions and millions of people dying of starvation. You'll even see a picture in your PowerPoint of people walking down the street, and off to the side there are bodies of people who have fallen down and died. The situation became that serious. And this was, the body counts in these famines are 10 times the body counts that we find in the worst famines under the Russian Tsars. So it wasn't just that this was some kind of freak of nature that suddenly agricultural output dropped and there were famines once communists took power in Russia. This was a result of communist ideology. It underlined the failure of communism to provide the food that was necessary for Russia or Russian people to survive, and it also underlined the ideological brutality of Stalin's regime. We know that he was okay with this happening because it eliminated sources of opposition to him. It increased his control over this society. We also know that he was exporting grain that would have provided food necessary for these people to survive out of Russia in order to make it look to the rest of the world as though he and his government were maintaining pre-revolution agricultural standards. And in order to prove, as he saw it, that Marxism was a successful economic system. And so this is the way in which Stalin attempts to implement the collectivization of agriculture and a communist approach to agriculture and the economy. We also find him attempting to implement a political approach, or the political implementation of communism. And this is through political purges. The removal, either through imprisonment or execution, around 700,000 people die, sometimes as many as 3,000 a day over the next 15 years. The removal of any figures in this society who could be a threat to Stalin's authority. Anyone connected with a religious organization, with the army, with businesses, politicians, even rival politicians within Stalin's own party. All of these had to be removed so that you had total loyalty to the state, which Marx had demanded as a means for establishing a communist society. And so these are the ways in which Stalin cements his control over Russia in the years leading up to World War I to carry out the implementation of this program.